welcome Alan Paul and Brad Tominski to begin tonight.
Hey everybody. So I'm Brad Tominski, and we're in for a great evening of Allman Brothers related conversation and music. And later we're going to be treated to a fantastic performance by friends of the brothers with a bunch of really cool special guests. But first we're going to kick off the evening with a brief discussion with author, musician Alan Paul, who has just written a terrific new book called Brothers and Sisters. Allman Brothers, 1970s. It's hot off the press, and I know a bunch of you guys have already gotten your copies over there, and I think Alan's going to sign a few of them for you. But Alan's book is a sequel to his terrific bestseller, One Way Out, New York Times bestseller. And many people consider it to be the definitive history of the Allman Brothers. So I want to talk to him this evening about the sequel and how it started and why do a sequel when you've done such a fantastic job on One Way Out.
It's because you told me to. Yeah, so listen, thank you, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Brad, for those nice words. But just to tell you who Brad is, he was the editor-in-chief of Guitar World magazine for decades. And he hired me for no good reason. I was literally, I had kicked around journalism for a couple of years and was giving up. I was applying to graduate school. I was going to become a teacher. I was sort of happy with that. And doing a lot of writing on the side. And I did a couple of little record reviews for Guitar World, and then he called me up and said, "Hey dude, you want to be the managing editor?" There was
I corrupted them. I saved them from a life of academia.
Yeah, not much more than that. So we've been friends since then. That was in 1991. I learned so much during my years working with Brad, for Brad, and then for years. And so literally, I'm not kidding, when Brad told me to do this book, it was a pandemic conversation. He spoke on the phone for about an hour when I had a long drive. And it was a long conversation, but the important part is I said I thought I was done writing about the Allman Brothers and I wanted to do some different stuff. And Brad was basically like, "You're crazy. You have this great following. You're an expert in a band that people care about. And furthermore, Brothers and Sisters is underexplored." And we had a long conversation, and the book ended up a little different than he conceived of it, but he really does get credit for the idea. And then after I thought it through and I sort of sketched out in my head what it would be, the next thing I did was call Kirk, who's, and so I just need to back up a second. Kirk and Brad, in different but related ways, have been like so central to my writing career. So it's really, really special for me to have them both here. So, I mean, in all seriousness, none of this would happen without Brad and without Kirk, for different but related reasons. And I called Kirk and ran the idea by him, and he thought it was a great idea. And then I talked to a couple other people, and then I talked to my agent, which is always important, and he thought it was a great idea. So I thought, okay, we have something here, and I started digging in. And so that was what got me started, but why to do it? There were so many things in this era. And just to be clear for those of you who haven't read it yet, which is most of you, it's not just about the album. The album is sort of at the center, and it's much more about the band, and there's also a lot of cultural history there. So, and the whole thing about Define the 70s, which I've taken a little bit of and if I realize that, I might not use it. No, I think it's true, but it's like a waste of time to have to talk about it a little bit. But since you're all my friends, we'll talk about it. Basically, the album had such an impact because they became so popular. They did the Watkins Glen, which we just had the 50th anniversary with the Grateful Dead and the band, and drew 650,000 people to the middle of nowhere, New York. It was really fun to write about that. There's 2 chapters. But what I'm talking about here is that just shows how culturally central they were. And then ultimately, of course, they led to the election of Jimmy Carter. I mean, without this album, there's no massive Allman Brothers success. There's no way they can boost Jimmy Carter, and this completely unknown governor of Georgia doesn't become president. And then Greg, got involved with Cher, and so we had the whole. They were sort of the hit couple of 1974 and 75. There was this new sort of celebrity culture emerging. People had just started, People Weekly, and they were on one of the early covers. So for all those reasons, they're central. And so it was really fun for me to write about the musical history, and it was really fun for me to write about the cultural history.
Well, you had done a lot of research and thought about the book quite a bit. And then you got a little bit of a gift from God. I mean, there's so many people might not know who Kirk West is, but tell them who Kirk is and how he became an important part of this book.
Yeah, well, so Kirk, the tour mystic, it's hard to describe who he is in the Allman Brothers history. I know that a lot of you hardcore fans like you know this, but it is hard to summarize, and why it had this strange title, Tour Mystic. Part of it is because he was basically the tour manager, as every band has, but he did so much more than that. So before he did that, he was their archivist, their historian, photographer. He really was a photographer by trade. He's a wonderful photographer. He has a great gallery in Macon. His photos are online, and they're not just of the Allman Brothers. Everybody, Tom Waits, the Rolling Stones, every country blues person I've been toured. So he's a great photographer. He became the tour mystic, I guess, after they reformed it in 89, 90. And before that, he was writing a book. And in 86 and 87 mostly, he went around the country all over the place, and he spent hours and hours interviewing everyone in the band and lots of other people like Bill Graham, the promoter, wives and crew members and managers. And when the band reformed and he started working for the band, became an employee, the book never happened for all those reasons. And that's where, before I get to how this factored in this book, that's actually how you helped me because I don't want to drag everyone down, but here's the thing. I told Brad about that once I was starting to become really friendly with Kurt, and Brad started saying, tell Kurt that to write a chapter for Guitar World. We would love it. Like, he could write a sample chapter, we'll run it. And it's like every time I would talk to Kurt, I would call him, leave a message on his answering machine. Kurt, it's Alan. Write that chapter. Finally, we spoke actually voice to voice, and he said, listen, man, I love the idea, appreciate the interest, but I'm not a writer. That's why the book didn't get written. And it's going to take me forever to do this, but I could collaborate on it. And so you sent me out to Chicago, and I spent 3 days in Kirk's basement, looking at photos. He had this incredible Allman Brothers archive, and interviewing him, and I go through this story with him, basically. And that was when our relationship went from, friendly and I guess a business relationship, because I was, a guy writing about the Allman Brothers, and he was a connection to help me make the interviews and stuff happen, to where we really became really good friends. And then he started having me backstage all the time, and then the crew and everyone got used to seeing me. I think Greg had no idea who I was, but he knew I was someone that was okay, because he just saw me a lot, like, oh, Kirk's friend, okay. So when I would go interview Greg, he'd be like, hey, buddy, how you doing? It was just, it bred a familiarity. And then when I started writing this book, after I'd already signed the contract and begun the process, Kirk said to me, would you like my tapes? Which were the tapes he had done for that book. So I said, yes. So even stepping back from who he is and what those how good the interviews proved to be, I didn't know that, of course, because I hadn't heard them yet. If you're a biographer and you get a cache of never before heard interviews with your subjects, many of whom are deceased, I mean, that's just an incredible gift. It's like the gold standard of what it's just incredible. So, yeah, so of course I said yes. I went down to Macon with my son Jacob, who I believe is here. So, and he came with me, which turned out to be great because Jacob is a photographer and he took pictures of Kirk handing the tapes to me, basically, and us looking at them together. And 3 of them are in the book, which I'm really proud of. I'm kind of delighted that moment was captured. And then I took them home, and it was amazing. And then I thought, holy shit, I've got hundreds of hours of tape. What am I going to do with them? So I started getting someone to digitize them, and I started listening to them. And the interviews are incredible. So it wasn't just that they existed, but that they existed and they were great.
I was sort of, you've told me about the story about getting the tapes, and I was sort of wondering, of course, there's hours and hours, but was there, 1 or 2 things that really gave you some special insight that maybe you hadn't had before?
Actually, there was so much. So, first of all, if you read the book carefully and you care, I would probably just read it if I was you. But for those of you who want to go look, you can, the sources of all the interviews are noted in the notes, and you can see what came from those interviews. And there's a lot of great stuff, but it's bigger than that. Like a lot of things that aren't in the book exactly. I just listening to all these interviews shaped my understanding of the people even better, and of their relationship with each other and to the music and how they felt about it and to various events. But to be more specific, one of the things that was really touching, but there was some of the stuff with Greg. As a lot of people know, in 2000, the band had an acrimonious party with Dickie Bass. And then, after that, Greg wouldn't say that many nice things about Dickie. Until the very end, his last, year, a couple of years of life, he was kinder, actually, in the way he spoke about him. But there had been so much resentments built up that it clouded the vision of what the actual relationship was earlier. And in this interview, another thing about these interviews, the band was broken up. So they didn't really have internal politics in the same way. And it was close enough to when they had broken up, they were wistful about, they were very aware of what they lost. They were all touring kind of in shabby conditions in the mid-'80s. It wasn't a very good time for their style of music. They didn't have the power of the Allman Brothers Band, and they were wistful. And Greg spoke just beautifully about Dickie, especially about Dickie's musical behavior, I guess I would say. The way he stepped forward after Dwayne died, and how the whole band would have fallen apart without Dickie.
Yeah, I was actually going to. It was a good segue into that, because really where Brothers and Sisters sort of picks up is after Dwayne and Barry died. And, I was sort of wondering what impact in your mind did the passing of those guys and Greg and Dickie taking over have on the band?
I wrote a whole book about that. No, of course, it's a central question.
You're looking for the Reader's Digest version.
No, it's a valid question, but it's so complex, it's hard to answer quickly. For a little background for those who don't know, Dwayne was absolutely the leader of the band in so many ways. He was the force of personality. It strikes me, reading about him, writing about him, and learning about him, talking about him, that, it's just, it's like a great point guard or a great quarterback. It's like, yeah, you need an offensive line, you need a running back and whatever, but you need a quarterback. If you don't have a great quarterback, you're only going to go so far. If you don't have a great point guard, you're only going to go so far. And that was Dwayne. He was a total leader. He was a visionary who conceived of what the band should be. And so they were sort of lost without him. Not just musically. Musically, they were okay, because Greg and Dickie were the songwriters. So Dwayne was an unusual leader of the band, but he wasn't the singer or the songwriter. So they were okay musically to continue. Either Greg or Dickie could have gone off on their own, and they both had the songwriting and the singing and the charisma, but they didn't have the leadership. So towards the end of this period, that all kind of caught up with them. But in the short term, it feels to me like the loss rallied them in a way that,
Yeah, when you think about the Allmans up until that point, it was really always them against the world. So they were used to almost playing from that kind of position. So, you have Craig and Dickie, and it sort of starts all over again, where it's us against the world again.
Yeah, that's why I said that those interviews with Greg are so revealing, because later he would be resentful, like, oh, Dickie took over the band, and we're going to do his songs. But in the short term, and he talks about this more in these 1986 and 87 interviews, he was aware that somebody had to step forward, and he was actually appreciative of the fact that Dickie had done it. And then Barry Oakley, bass player who died 2 songs into the recording of this album, almost exactly a year later from Dwayne, and almost exactly a eerily similar accident, like about less than a half mile apart. His death was also really musically crippling, and on the surface it was leadership-wise crippling because he had been sort of the second in command, but it was less so because he had been such a mess for a year. He sort of, I think it was Greg says in the book, Barry died the day Dwayne died. It's pretty haunting, and I went into it. I mean, that was a decision I had to make, like, how much do I go into this? Because they talked about it so much, but it was really, really difficult year for them. In part, at the same time they were dealing with grieving Dwayne and figuring out how to move without him, they were dealing with this, very depressed bandmate.
Yeah, when we were first talking about you doing this book, we got on the topic of the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead. And I think this is, a lot of fun, how Alan developed it in the book. And it's something that people don't really think about, other than here's 2 different bands that jam together, or play long songs or improvise a lot or something like that. But what do you think the connection was between the Allman Brothers and the Grateful Dead? It was more than just improvising.
Yeah, so that was really fun. And that was from the start of writing this book. I knew I was going to write about that, and I felt like it was sort of underexplored. There's a lot of crossover. I mean, there's a few people here in Dead shirts that I saw when I was signing books. I mean, and it's not uncommon. I mean, you go to all the other shows, there's always been people with Danny t-shirts and vice versa. So there's so much crossover with the fan base, me included. And one of the reasons I think it was a little underexplored is it turned out it peaked during this era, and they played 2 shows at RFK Stadium in Washington with 83,000 people over the 2 days, and then they played Watkins Glen, of course, and then New Year's Eve in 1973, Jerry Garcia, Bill Kreisman sat in with the Allman Brothers. They played until 4 in the morning, and it was incredible. It seemed to be like this relationship was so fruitful, and then it just ended. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about why it ended, and for good reason, because there's no clear answer. There's no one answer, but it becomes more clear, and I lay it out in the book. But partly it was that they were never quite, their careers were never fully aligned. Again, Jerry said some unkind things about Greg in 1976, and then Greg was really hurt by that. So in later years, and in his book, his memoir, Greg, basically said, "Oh, I always hated the Grateful Dead. They were." It's really not true. I found a lot of contemporaneous interviews in 1973 or 74 where he said all the beautiful things about them. And I think you were asking actually what their kinship was, and it's like they both came from these roots backgrounds. Grateful Dead a little more from folk and jug bands and stuff.
And Dickie a lot from folk music as well. That's never really talked about as much, but you hear those elements in both of those bands.
And so the relationship between the bands was always a lot more talked about Dwayne and Jerry, because Dwayne had these epic sit-ins with the Grateful Dead. But musically, in terms of what you're saying, Garcia and Dickie had much more of a kinship. And they both came from this string music background. And Dickie calls it string music, it's bluegrass. Dickie learned about it, I think, before the word bluegrass existed. His father called it string music. Dickie Betts played violin and fiddle and ukulele before he ever played guitar. And you hear that in his music. If you're a musician, you can hear that, you would recognize that. But if you're not a musician, you still intrinsically hear it. You might not be able to analyze that, but that's like those melodies that you hear in Blue Sky, in Rambo Man, and to some extent, those are kind of like fiddle melodies that he's playing on the electric guitar.
I think you told me one time that Dickie had to actually stop listening to Jerry Garcia.
Yeah, he told me that. He said, well, this was cool. So one of my projects during the pandemic, when I was so bored out of my mind, is I went through my archives before I was actively working on this book, and then a little bit while I was, and I just started digitizing my tapes. But I did that like the old-fashioned way. I just put them on a tape deck and ran my iPhone, because I wasn't trying to archive them so much as sort of, hear them and create somewhat of an archive. And I heard an interview with Dickie that I did before the interview was started. Like I luckily had the tape roll and we're just bullshitting. I had forgotten he said this and it got lost. He said, well, I had this idea of taking, these major key bluegrass melodies, string music melodies, putting them into a rock and roll context. And when first time I heard the Grateful Dead, because the Grateful Dead was recording for 4 years before the Allman Brothers ever formed. And he said, the first time I heard the Grateful Dead, I said, God damn it, that guy beat me to it. He recognized it immediately, and then he started listening to them a lot. And he said that he found himself playing Garcia licks all the time. And so he stopped listening to the Grateful Dead, because he said, I didn't want to copy my peers. And so anytime I find myself playing like a peer, I stop and I listen to B.B. King and Reinhardt.
That happens when you're a musician, you love somebody so much, that's part of the musical experience, right? Is loving other music, and you have to stop listening to the person because you love their music so much. I think that's always sort of fun. When I tore into this book, I was so thrilled that Alan went very deep into 2 albums that, I don't know how many times I listened to them, which is Greg's first solo record, Laid Back, and Dickie Betts' record, Highway Call, which is really a beautiful and underrated record, I think. Could you talk a little bit more about those records and the impact that they had on the band?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, it was really fun to do that because I also love those records. Highway Call especially just got sort of lost in time, partly because Dickie just never did a band like that again, and he never did, so the song sort of disappeared. Laid Back, I think, has stayed a little more in play because that became a template for Greg's solo career, which he continued when the Allman Brothers were broken up, and then in later years, parallel to the Allman Brothers, right up until his passing almost in 2017. So the songs on Laid Back, Greg mostly never stopped playing. They were the core of his solo career. So I feel like the story of it was still really cool to tell, but the songs are more familiar to people. Highway Call, again, a great record, and it was thrilling to tell the story. I don't think it had that much impact on the band, though, because it was like this weird one-off. I always thought Dickie should have gone back to that style of music. I mean, he does it so well.
Did you ever think...
It's sort of Western swing.
You didn't really pull this out of your book, but it's funny thinking about, reading your book and thinking about those records. I was like, I sort of wonder if they had actually, Greg and Dickie had, instead of recording those solo records, had just pooled the best of those 2 records, whether there would have been another Brothers and Sisters instead of Win, Lose, or Draw.
Yeah, well, sort of, but not really, because Highway Call, yes, that preceded that. So Laid Back, I said Highway Call didn't have that much impact on the Allman Brothers. Laid Back had a big impact on the Allman Brothers, but mainly because it brought Chuck Leavell into the band. So they toured for a year after Dwayne's death with the 5-piece band, and I think did remarkably well. It's sort of one of the cooler stories in rock, but I think they were running out of steam, and they all knew it. Like, they had worked so hard to cover this loss, and Dickie did this remarkable thing where he learned slide guitar. Dwayne was, most people's favorite slide guitarist to this day, 50 years later. And Dickie did that. So, but they were running out of steam, and they didn't quite know what to do, and they didn't want to hire another guitarist because, as Dickie said, that would be the most morbid thing we could do. That was his explanation for why he learned to slide guitar, because they couldn't hire someone else to play those parts. So well, they were in a little bit of a holding pattern, and Greg just decided to do a solo record because he had written the song Queen of Hearts, which is just a beautiful song. And when they had a first meeting of talking about the album, that the song was rejected, and by the Allman Brothers, which really hurt Greg. And he said later, I won't say who turned it down, but his initials are Butch Trucks. I didn't put that in the book because I couldn't find the actual quote, but I'm absolutely 100% sure he said it. So he just was like, well, fuck you, I'll just record it myself then. So he started working on this solo record, and Johnny Stanley was a producer called Chuck Lavelle, the piano player. And as that was going on, I think Chuck was 20 years old. You know, just like there's no explanation for how Derek Trucks could play like Wayne Allman when he was 14. There's really no explanation for how Chuck Lavelle could play the way he played when he was 20. And he talks about his influences. It's like the usual piano players, I mean, Elton John and Leon Russell and Nicky Hop, but he just doesn't sound really like any of them to me. I mean, you could hear touches of that, but...
Yeah, he sort of mixed in a little more Floyd and stuff like that.
Yeah, but he says he didn't like really study that, but he heard it on the radio. But he's just, he's a unique talent, and you know, that's like the great talents you can't really, you can sort of explain them, but you ultimately can't. And yeah, so they started having these jam sessions after the way back, like Dickie and Butch would come, and they kind of realized pretty quickly that something special was happening. And so, I don't know if they ever would have even recorded Brothers and Sisters if they hadn't kind of stumbled on Chuck, because Laid Back then kind of got pushed to the side and ultimately finished in between and then after. So it came out months after Brothers and Sisters, but they started it first, and that's what brought Chuck in, and Chuck totally energized the band.
So where does Brothers and Sisters, where is that in your personal pantheon of all the Brothers records?
Probably fourth. I mean, no, it's a great record. It's a short record. Jelly Jelly is cool. It's kind of a throwaway track. I think the highlights of it are great. You know, the very, you know, I do think in some ways it was the most important Allman Brothers record, although whatever. I guess it just depends how you look at it. Phil Maurice is what broke them and let everyone see how great they were live, so maybe that's it. You know, Eat a Peach showed they could continue without Dwayne, and it was a really great record, and it set the table for Brothers and Sisters. I mean, it is important to remember, like, as much as they blew up with Brothers and Sisters, they were pretty popular and growing. It's not like they were a club band and they blew up. I mean, Watkins Glen and those stadium shows and everything happened before Brothers and Sisters was released. So they were a band that was on the rise, and then they exploded with Ramblin' Man. But, you know, a few of the songs on the record especially are just stand up to anything and are really, really different from anything they've done before, partly because of Chuck. I mean, Jessica, I think speaks for itself. I mean, people who know the song and don't know anything about the Allman Brothers, because it's played in and out of sports games and stuff all the time. Come and Go Blues, I think, is one of the best songs Greg ever did. It's his only like truly great song on the album.
I agree that song completely gets looked over. I think it's one of their best songs.
Yeah, but Pony Boy's just cool, you know, totally different. And Ramblin' Man, I mean, the big hit, you know, eventually, like, and I address this in the book, you know, the Allman Brothers fans even started to, like, roll their eyes at it, because there was so much more to the band, and it was atypical, totally outside what they sounded like. And they got sick, the band and some of the fans, got sick of this group they loved, or this group they played in, being so associated with the song that sounded nothing like anything else they did. Which I guess makes sense, right? But at the same time, when you listen to it outside of that context, it's a pretty damn great song. And, you know, I tell the story in the book about, I guess it was 2005 or something, I forget, but Dickie went to sit in with Bob Dylan. They were buddies, and in Florida. And they were hanging out backstage, and so Dickie said, well, what do you want to play? Well, what do you want me to play on? And he was ready to play on, like, It Takes a Train or something, you know. And Bob says, well, why don't we do Ramblin' Man? And Dickie's like, all right, you know, that'd be awesome. And so he gets a pen and a pad paper and a Sharpie and starts writing out the lyric. And the Bob said to him, and we can swap verses. And so Dickie starts writing out the lyrics, and he looks at me and goes, I know the lyrics, Dickie. He said, that's the best. He said, that song's so damn good, I should have written it. Which is a great line from Bob, but it's also, you know, what else is, you know, I mean, Bob Dylan knew all the words to Ramblin' Man. That's pretty cool.
It's a pretty good song. So just a couple more questions, and then we're going to move on to the music. You know, I think that, you know, somebody picking up this book is going to be surprised at the story behind the Allman Brothers' relationship with Jimmy Carter. It's substantial. He helped get they helped get Jimmy elected.
Yeah, so, and the thing is, it was a real friendship. So there's a quote in the book, I think it was from Peter Conlon, who worked for the Carter campaign, liaising with music, who said Jimmy Carter was not an opportunist, but he saw an opportunity. And I think that's pretty much sums it up. He was nowhere. I mean, he was a one-term governor of Georgia. He had no national profile whatsoever. And he decided to run for president. Phil Walden, who was the band's manager and record label owner, which is a huge conflict that's thoroughly explored in the book. But he had been a supporter of Carter when he was governor. And he immediately said, okay, we should help you out, not just with the Allman Brothers, but with music. He had this concept of raising money with music. And this was the first year, remember this is the first post-Watergate election. There was a lot of election reforms brought in then. So, there was a cap on personal donations, and there was federal matching funds for the first time. So in order to generate money, it was a huge advantage for Kennedy to be able to have something like a concert that might raise $40,000 and then get $40,000 matching funds. Because I think the personal donation, I forget what it was, I don't want to say it wrong, it was quite low what people could give. And so it was hard to raise big swaths of money. There were no PACs at that point. So it was a huge thing for him, and it was also, you know, a huge profile boost because the Allman Brothers were, you know, the most popular band in the country. And, but I think it's important to note that they really liked him. They liked his politics. Phil Walden liked his politics. A lot of more progressive Southern people were really, you know, the governor before Jimmy Carter was Lester Maddox, who was famous for being a virulent racist. I mean, he owned a restaurant and he shut it down rather than integrate it. He at one point, they tried to come have a sit-in at his restaurant and he beat kids with an axe handle. And there was a picture of that went out on the AP, and so everyone in America knew about this guy. And they were embarrassed by him. So like Phil Walden says in one of these interviews, he would come up here to New York and get in a cab, and like a cabbie would say, boy, you sure know how to handle those people down there. And he hated that. It enraged him that that's what his home state was associated with. Phil had started as Otis Redding's manager. They worked together since they were teenagers. He felt that he had a huge debt to the African American community that had really embraced him, brought him in, and he built his career on, really. And so Carter's, his racial politics, I think, were really the core thing that drew these guys to him.
Well, your book made me really love Jimmy Carter even more, because it wasn't just that they liked Jimmy. Jimmy seemed to really extend himself to those guys and stay loyal to Greg for...
Yeah. So not only did he stay loyal to Greg, when everybody else turned his back on him, and it was a couple of months before the presidential election when any politician in the world that other politician that we know of, would have just said, you know, I'm sorry, my friend Greg has gone off this path, and I thank him for his help, and later, you know, and he didn't do that. In fact, he said something to the effect of, you know, if you want a president who doesn't hang out with people like the Allman Brothers, you should just vote for someone else. And but also he liked the music, and not just the Allman Brothers. He loved music. I mean, he was a big fan of jazz. I mean, you look at who he brought to the White House, and this was a big deal at the time. It was Dizzy Gillespie, Muddy Waters. You know, I mean, he embraced this. I think that this kind of music is America's greatest creation and export to the world. I think it's like our greatest strength in projecting whatever soft power and culture. I mean, blues and jazz and country music, and then the rock and roll that came from it, are completely American forms of art, and they're, you know, they've helped define the last, whatever, 100 years, and Jimmy Carter understood that, and he embraced it.
I mean, you had Richard Nixon before Jimmy Carter. That's how different, that's how radical. I mean, it was sort of mind-blowing, actually.
Yeah, so, yeah, God bless him for that, and I think that whatever people think of his politics, and you know, the fact that he embraced that music should matter to music fans, and the fact that he stayed loyal to these guys when the easiest thing in the world to do would have been cut and run, I think should be, you know, that's just a good lesson for life.
So, in a couple minutes, we're going to bring, you know, the Friends of the Brothers on stage, and Alan plays with them. And Alan has a special guest joining me tonight, right?
Yes, and I'll introduce them all as they come out, but there's so many special guests, but the three that I'll highlight that are super special are the sons of Allman Brothers and guys who are central to this record. Dwayne Batts, the son of Dickie, obviously. Billy Trucks, who's not only the son of Butch, but he's the adorable 2-year-old kid on the cover of Brothers and Sisters. And as you'll soon see, he's an adorable 53-year-old man now. He'll be joining us, and Lamar Williams Jr. Obviously, is the son of Lamar Williams, who we haven't even talked about, but I love my chapters on him as well.
And I've heard all these guys, and they fly the flag well. They carry the tradition.
Yeah, they're not out here doing it just because they're the sons. I mean, it's you know,
great players.
Yeah, great players, and they're carrying on this tradition, and you know, I'm happy and proud to be a part of it.
So just my final question here is, you play this music. Has, you know, writing has writing this book made you look at what you play in a different kind of way?
Yeah, a little bit. I think more playing it has made me look at it when I write it in a different way. Because I mean, I've sort of played this music for a long time, but once I started doing this band, and I got so much deeper into it, I had to learn more of the repertoire, and I've gotten to play with so many great people. And the core of the band, you'll meet the two guitar players, Andy Alador, our longtime colleague and Junior Mack. Junior played with Jim once, technically still plays with Jim. Jim just doesn't play much for about 15 years. And he's, you know, both these guys have played with the Allman Brothers and Government Mule and all these associated bands. And so it's not just me learning the songs, it's me standing and watching these guys work the parts out, and what they do has given me a deep understanding. And I don't know, it works together. I feel like the writing is helping me play it better, and the playing is helping me play it better.
Well, thanks for both of the things. Thanks for the band. Thanks for the books.
Again, thank you, Brad, for everything, for a whole career. I'm so glad I'm not a high school English teacher. And for the idea for this book, and thank all of you for coming. I have so many, you know, friends here, and so many, you know, friends from music, from the show, and my family. My parents are here. My brother, two of my three kids, so it really means a lot. And in fact, as long as we're on that subject, the book is dedicated to 5 people, and they're all 5 here, I think. So I think I should just read the dedication off. If I can remember it precisely, I think I can. And for Kirk and Kirsten West, who opened the door, held my hand, and led me into Wonderland. For my parents, Susie and Dixie, who always let me be me. I didn't add this part of the dedication, but I could have, even when it required severe biting of the tongue. And for Rebecca, always for Rebecca. My wife, we've been together for so long that it's impossible for me to imagine where my life would be otherwise. Would be somewhere different, very different. So thank you all, and thanks for being here. In a few minutes, we'll be out, back out.